Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy, and I'm your host, Steve. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can always send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Now, there are many ways to support the show. First and foremost, listening and even telling a friend, liking a YouTube video or subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking and ringing the bell. If you have a coin or two to throw in the coffers, Patreon is a great way to support the show. Now, before we get too far, let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, and Christina at the Alexandria level, and Dapo and Paul the Magnificent, both of them are magnificent, at the Constantinople level. Now, reaching the ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great. This episode is an edited version of the second presentation I've done on literacy in the ancient world. These episodes are really fun and special for me because I can talk about many subjects I'm passionate about. The history of the popes of Rome, Christianity, the Bible, book production, literacy, and the history of literacy. I'm putting these episodes out and slowly, first on a live stream, and then I always edit them down for the podcast and then republication on YouTube in a more put together form. I will let everyone know on all my social media channels and as a quick announcement on the podcast feed when I plan on doing a live stream event next. I'll probably do another one in March or April-ish of 2021. And I'll let you know as well which platforms I'll be streaming those to. This is an ever-evolving thing with syndication software and platforms, or whatever they call them these days. So if you have a platform you would like to be seen on the live stream, just let me know and I will look into it. Also, you are interested, you or your company can sponsor the live stream as well. So if you'd like to do that, please get in contact with me and we can work that out. With that, here is another piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. We are going to talk about something called ancient literacy, which is really an all-encompassing thing, and it's a huge topic, but it's really going to help us narrow in on more about the history of the papacy, the history of the early church, and how we can get through that. Now, first, we're going to focus in right up to the times with the Greeks, especially on the purpose of literacy and literacy education. And I've decided purposefully I'm going to focus in on biblical Jewish, early Christian, Roman, and then medieval literacy and other and later episodes, because it really is a complicated and a really big topic. And I don't want to bite off more than I can chew in this small section of time. A big part of my sources is a book called Ancient Literacy by William Harris, which came out about 20 years ago. And there's some other articles that I use, but his book was really one of the big books that was available that really delved into the idea of literacy and how people learned to read and how people used what they read and wrote. Now, there's a spectrum of literacy. You go from illiterate to literate, lettered, unlettered. Unlettered and lettered is kind of a derogatory term used today for somebody who can't read, and it was even used all the way back by the Greeks. The ancient Greeks actually had a saying. It's Plato was quoted to have said that this was a common saying, that he doesn't understand letters and he doesn't know how to swim. So I guess that somebody like Plato and an ancient Greek would have thought that those were two very important skills to have mastered. Now, let's look at some different things here. Harris uses two different types of literacy that were common in the ancient world: craftsman literacy and scribal literacy. Scribal literacy is kind of what you would imagine professional scribes who maintain records, copied books. If you think of the scribes of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, or even the clerks or clerics of the Middle Ages who sat at their desks, they wrote, they copied a lot of things. And it was a professional trade of being a scribe. You went through a apprenticeship and you learned how to do this job, and you had a very specific job. Now, craftsman literacy, that was where skilled craft workers who had at least some minimum literacy skills in order to engage in their commercial business. So maybe you're a wheelwright, and you have to know some basics of literacy in order to operate your business. This might include something like numeracy too, which we won't talk too much about today, but being able to count and do figures. You needed those sort of skills to be able to be a successful craftsman. Now, generally in the ancient world, unskilled laborers and women were the most likely in society to be illiterate. Slaves could be literate or non-literate depending on the circumstances. So how and when do people learn to read? And that's, I'm going to try and give the long story short here. Research shows that humans are hardwired for speech. Babies start to develop their basics of speech right in the womb from listening to their mom speak. After a child is born, they start to make certain speech milestones, and these are predictable and usually happen within a certain time frame. Some children hit their speech milestones earlier than later, but there's a range, and doctors know what's inside of that range, and specialists. But anyways, we'll get to that in a second. Now, children progress and develop in speech and all the way up into their adolescence. They're learning new sounds, words, grammar, syntax of their native language or languages. And it's perfectly normal for them to make mistakes. The cute things kids say are often a part of that process. They're maybe making sounds or using words incorrectly. They're not applying the irregular parts of a language correctly. An example of that might be when a kid says "butter" or "dat" instead of "that," and the mispronunciation of "brother" and "that," and oftentimes incorrect conjugations of verbs or usage of verbs. It's the child fine-tuning their use of our sound system or their sound system and the grammatical system of the language. Second language learners often go through this process as well, and it's common to every language. There's another thing that's really important to developing literacy, and that's visual development and gross and fine motor skills. Children's visual and spatial development begins very early as well. Babies have a limited visual ability. They can see patterns and short distances. As children develop, their vision gets crisper and they can see shapes and then discriminate between shapes. Those are all skills necessary to read. You need to be able to see and interpret different shapes and different shape combinations. And it takes time for this visual acuity to develop. Up to the age 7 and even older, letters may appear backwards or upside down. If this lasts longer, it may be the sign of an issue that would be explored more by specialists, doctors, and experts. But it's really when you're getting into that 7 to 10-ish range, the visual acuity in order to read is pretty much ready to go. Then there's fine motor development. This is the developmental skill that one would need to write. Now, gross motor skills, that's like running, jumping, throwing, and fine motor skills are precision movements like feeding oneself, the pincher grasp to pick up food or a spoon. And this skill develops over time. You watch a baby just learning to feed itself. I saw a video of my son came up of him trying to put something in his mouth, and it's like, misses and hits the forehead, or they hit their shoulder trying to put that cookie in their mouth. Now, eventually the child becomes more coordinated and can do these activities with much more precision. So these are also the skills that you need for writing. You need to be able to hold a writing utensil properly and use that utensil in a coordinated way to write abstract shapes, be they letters, numbers, symbols, or logograms, you name it. As a person's speech system, visual acuity, and fine motor skills develop, they will move along in the process of learning literacy. As a side note, children often learn to speak a new language very easily because they are still developing their first language system. Their brains are still wiring up for language, so they learn the new language quickly. There's some debate as to when that ability stops. Now, adults or older learners will often learn the writing and the reading system of a new language much better than children do because they have fully developed speech systems in their first language, and they've developed an understanding of the reading and the writing system of that language, so they can carry those skills over. Plus, they already have fully developed fine motor and visual systems. That issue will come up a bit when we start talking much more about the Gospels and writers who very well may have been, many of them were educated and fluent in multiple languages. Now let's talk a little bit about learning to read and write. And that's basically education and what education is and what it looks like. We'll talk in general, and I'll give a little context of how reading and writing is taught today. And I'll mainly focus on the English language and mostly the U.S., but similar concepts are definitely happen in other countries for sure in their educational system. Now, I would love to hear your personal experiences with learning to read and write. Now, up to very recently, children needed to work in order to help sustain the family. They had a limited time to learn to read and write. Reading and writing, or literacy, is something that needs to be taught, and it doesn't just develop like speech. You need some exposure to the system or the code from the outside in order to master that skill. Numeracy and literacy were not as clearly differentiated in ancient times as they were today. Having your letters and having your numbers were both very important in certain circles, and they kind of blended together. But like I said, basic mathematics is way beyond the scope of this episode, but it's a very interesting topic in its own right. Now, for modern day literacy instruction, let's talk about that so that we can have some context for ancient literacy instruction. You got to learn the basic skills first: letter names, the sounds that letters make, then reading words, then reading sentences, paragraphs, and longer texts. There's something called in the education circles called the reading wars, and it's a major controversy over how students should learn to read and write. And it really it's a kind of two opposite ways. But let's dive into a little bit more about different types and purposes of literacy, because that'll illuminate a little bit of why we're talking about how people are educated. Now, there's higher literacy, the academic, and then there's mundane literacy, commercial activities, accounts, inventories, reading signs, wills, contracts, so all that commercial and then academic. And then you add reading and writing for religious purposes. The Sumerians were doing that all the way back in the 3400s BCE. The earliest Old Testament of the Bible, 1400s BC. Sanskrit Vedas or Vedas. I'll go with Vedas, 1500s BCE, and other really old religious texts. We can go all the way back. The Chinese oracle bones written in an early version of the Chinese characters back in the 1600s BCE. Administrative purposes, laws, edicts, and regulations, that was also in there as well. Right around the 7th century BCE, the first Greek laws are being written down. In the early days of writing, it was really for practical needs, religious, storytelling tied to religion, and some commercial purposes. But all of it was really revolving on religion and, to a certain degree, running of the early state. Things start to change a bit during the Greek classical age. Writing was still used for religious and economic purposes, that's for sure, but also for histories, plays, political tracts, speeches, and other genres started to be recorded. Another is epistolae, or instructions. Thucydides, Herodotus, those are some of the writers that we would be familiar with. Homer, obviously. And so this is a major change in the writing, the purpose of writing, and the style. But most written works were intended to be read out loud for their audience. So very few books read really sheets of paper, maybe a few scrolls were really available. Speeches were orated and plays were acted. Histories were shared or read out, and even letters were shared orally by a messenger before the text was shared. It was really, the Greeks put a lot on verbally and orally sharing. How did the ancient Greeks learn to read? Well, now there's a lot of different theories, and a lot of this, we should really talk about the class differences. You had people who were very wealthy, some people kind of in the middle of that range, especially the craftsmen, and then you had the balance of other people who were slaves, unskilled labor, farmers. For the most part, women, you can include them in that group of people who are not in the mainstream of literacy. The wealthy, if you were wealthy, you went to school and you learned in a more formal way. Now, my theory is that a lot more literacy than maybe the scholars are giving credit for was taught at the home. Women did learn some reading, and it doesn't show up necessarily in the written record, but women were helping and working with their husbands and their crafts. And I think that moms teaching their children their ABCs, if you will, their alpha, beta, gammas, that would have been a serious part of how certain groups of people would have learned to read and write. But like I said, scholars dispute whether ancient Greeks did any early literacy schooling at home. So how much did your average classical Greek know about reading and writing? Probably very little. Elites were much more likely to be literate, and they put a lot more importance on that, but maybe 5 to 10% of ancient Greeks knew how to read. And I mean, it's impossible to really put any actual figures on these estimates because it's just a wild shot in the dark. Most women would not have been able to read. Most of everybody would not have been able to read or write. But if you were looking in more of the higher echelons of society, a much larger percentage of them would have been able to read. Now you have the Hellenistic Greeks. This is that post-Alexander era. Greeks introduced to these enormously complicated administrative states in Mesopotamia and Egypt and Persian. There's documentations of everything: contracts, receipts, reports, intergovernmental letters. So kind of a synergy of, if you will, of Greeks expanding the purpose of writing with the older Mesopotamian and Egyptian complex administrative states and their purposes for literacy merged together. And I guess that's a big part of Hellenism, is these new Greek ideas that they're developing combined with the ideas of the Mesopotamians and the Persians and the Egyptians and other groups. The use of paperwork spread into much more common usage, whether you like it or you don't. Paperwork, common transactions were recorded. Even people who were illiterate were given receipts for transactions. So they must have valued that transaction that they did. I sold X amount of pigs. That's one of the examples, was a pig farmer in Egypt who, he was illiterate, but he wanted a receipt that he had sold a certain amount of pigs to a guy. Written text in scroll format are becoming more common, but there's still no publishing industry, so to speak. So no mass publication of written works. If someone wanted a book, they copied a pre-existing version of that book. I use book, and whenever you read the sources, they use book, but they weren't really books at that point. They were scrolls, but I'm really using that term as a text. And those people who could afford to get a copy, beg, borrow, or steal a copy of an existing text and then have it laboriously written, on how we know that a lot of those writing materials were highly expensive. You're really talking about sponsored scholars, kings, and wealthy individuals. Those are the people who have that access. Some larger libraries developed, the Library of Alexandria, the Library in Pergamum. I call these larger because in the grand scheme of things, they didn't carry that much information. It was a ton for the day, but the scroll format and the way that these scrolls had to be stored just didn't allow for that much information density. So they definitely had a lot of information in them and a lot of texts, but really not as much as what we might think from the popular imagination. An emphasis was on the ideal of universal education. Education's expensive. Teachers need to be hired, or slaves used. They were called pedagogos. And either way, if you were having a hired teacher or you had a slave who was highly educated, that's completely out of the grasp of a subsistence farmer or an unskilled laborer. You needed building space, which is expensive. You need texts, expensive materials, deferment of other activities, children working in the family fields or in the family shop doing their trade. They were deferring learning a skilled trade. More so, families had to pay for some way for the actual attendance of the school, so they had to pay a tuition. Education in some places was subsidized by wealthy benefactors in some of the big cities, and not generally supported by government funds. And this is common for other institutions, citywide institutions as well. Many children were able to attend, but it's not universal education by any means. And it definitely wasn't universal for Copts, the Aramaic speakers, the Persians, the Carians, other speakers who were native to the lands that the Greeks had conquered and controlled, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, and etc. Girls were educated more than they ever were during this Hellenistic period than they were in ancient Greece, but still not very well represented. And the poor were not well represented in education at all either. So a big theme, literacy was spreading and it was respected. Literacy was something attainable to the middle class, not just for the highest echelons of society anymore. Being educated and literate was a sign of success, a social marker. And the iconography of the day shows this. People had paintings done of them holding writing tools and books. As the Romans took over Hellenized areas, money started to dwindle for this Greek style of school, at least for the masses or the relative masses. So this is a good time. How did the ancient and Hellenistic Greeks learn to read and write? The alphabet is fairly easy to learn, and it doesn't matter if it's the Greek alphabet, the Latin alphabet that we use, the alphabet used by invented by the Phoenicians. It's 26 to maybe 30-ish characters, and you're learning the names of them, and that's where the songs come in, the A, B, C, D, E, F, G song, and there's
versions of that song that go all the way back to the Greeks and I believe the Phoenicians. Next thing you got to do is you have to learn the sound and the letter correspondence. So you have to learn that symbol for B makes the sound B. And Socrates actually describes the process as it was used by the ancient Greeks. Well, first they learn the names of the letters and the sounds the letters make, and then they would learn those sounds, and they put a consonant with the vowel sounds. So he even uses that example. S and O gets you, S and an O gets O, so, and you've got the first part of Socrates. You put another consonant in there and you build from there. It's almost like what we would do in English. K, at, consonant, vowel, consonant, really common pattern in English. Come together, you get cat. So once you've got there, you build one syllable onto two and more syllables, and you get that, you start to build up that word, Socrates, 3 syllables. Then you start, so once you're starting to be able to read whole words, you start reading nouns and then adding verbs onto those nouns. Well, next thing you know, you're reading everything. The process Socrates describes, in a way, really does work. You're starting with letter ID, moving to phonemic awareness. You continue to move on to more complicated tasks in a systematic way. And you don't need a ton of tools to do this. You don't need iPads, Chromebooks, and all that new materials that the textbook publishers come out with every 2 years. It's good for parents and kids, not so much for those textbook publishers, but it's a very systematic way to move from very basic to more complex. And reading practice was mostly reading out loud, and reading to oneself was not actually common until much, much later. It really didn't come into vogue until the Renaissance and mass availability of people to get their hands on personal texts, where people would go and sit at home mostly. I mean, I won't jump too far ahead here, but even if you were able to read, you probably didn't have a Bible in your home. Where you've interacted with that text, was it being read to you by somebody who knew how to read, a priest, and you were hearing it. Now, learning to write started with practicing individual letters, and then you moved on to dictating syllables, then dictating words and sentences. That works too. It's one way that even today people learn to read and write to write in this specific case, is dictating letters, dictating sounds, then dictating and writing words and moving on from there. It's really a tried and true ways to teach reading and writing. It's those, in many ways, those are strategies that work. Now, Plato said that reading and writing could be taught in 3 years from age 10 to 13, which is 5 to 6 years older than when most kids in the U.S. start to learn to read and write. Even, really of learning the ABCs, most parents will start introducing their kids to the ABCs when they're 1 or 2 years old. Even old kids in Europe, where that's probably what I'm most familiar with, is they usually don't start reading until they're 6, 7. That's older than the U.S., 6, 7, 8, but it's still not as old as the ancient Greeks did. Herodotus mentions in one of his books a 13-year-old who couldn't master his letters. So that says that a 13-year-old who's having a hard time maybe even doing some of those more elementary steps. So that might have been a sign of a child with a learning disability or some other educational need. Now, the system the Greeks used does not seem to me, at least, to be very flexible or designed to meet the needs of a diverse range of learners, but that really wasn't what it was created to do. It was the early days. You were teaching people this method to get to this point in reading. Now, after students learned the basics, then they started to have a discussion of what they read. The Socratic method and all of that, that we would talk about. And that's where they would learn to interpret and analyze texts. And that's the next step. You learn the basics. You learn to read sentences, paragraphs. Now it's time to actually look at a text and see what it means. The texts that they would use are what basically we would call the classics, Homer, in the time of Socrates and Plato, those sorts of people. And really, by the time these students were 13, 14 years old, they were mature enough and had enough background knowledge to really start diving into complicated texts. When you look at the way the Greeks taught literacy, you can see why no real primer books or children's literature have been found or at least survived. There probably really wasn't any available. They went right for real, authentic texts. Why start with reading Spot Loves His Friends when you can expect students to start reading Moby Dick? It's a different mindset of how you would teach reading in that respect. And any stories that were told to children, to younger children under that age of 10, where they would start going to the school, really probably would have been oral stories and not read to them at all. It was, telling the old stories and maybe even telling some of those classic stories. But it kind of makes sense though. By 10, most kids have hit and developed all the skills they need to really quickly learn to read and write. In the earlier ages, they can learn skills that are more developmentally appropriate, but they're not going to be able to move past where they are developmentally. The Greeks highly valued literacy, but they also highly valued athletics, musical ability, and many other abilities to make somebody a well-rounded person. Now, I wanted to start with the Greeks because they are going to be important for literacy of the Bible, all the way back into Second Temple Judaism, and some of the gospel writers were clearly educated in the Greek tradition, Matthew, Luke, John, Paul, where Mark was not as strong in Greek. He may have been a second language learner, or maybe he knew Greek and could write it, but he just wasn't well schooled in it. I mean, there's a lot of questions there that we can hopefully dig into. Then we'll move on to Roman and the Jewish idea on literacy, and we will have more on book culture and upcoming live stream events and episodes. And if you like these live streams and the topics, please let me know. I personally really love this topic, or I guess I wouldn't be talking about it. And definitely like the video, subscribe to my History of the Papacy podcast YouTube channel, and hit the bell so that you get updates, especially when the History of the Papacy in 10 Minutes episodes start coming out this fall or spring if you're one of our Southern Hemisphere friends. And then look up the History of the Papacy on Patreon if you'd like to find ways to support the show even more.